Okay, so on the main channel, here on the sports channel, I've been getting a lot of questions that aren't sport related. And I haven't done a video on the History Boffin channel for, well, since the summer, um, since the middle of summer. So I thought, you know what, I will do a non-sports related um, live stream. So let's see how many viewers actually want to watch. So much to discuss that isn't sport related. I've been having questions sent to me in comment sections relating to politics, film, video games, social stuff. Obviously, with what's going on with the pandemic and various lockdowns around the world, there's a lot of questions that I think I can answer. It's going to be really interesting to see what questions are posted in the chat, because yeah, as I say, for the last, I'm going to say 6 months, I've been getting more and more questions in live streams on the sports channel, on the main channel, to do with politics, to do with what's going on in the US and Canada, to do what's going on in Australia, to do with what's happening around the world. And it's really interesting. I mean, look at Holland right now. They're going through a political crisis. Their government has basically resigned. The Rutte cabinet, I think it's his third government he's formed, has resigned in recent weeks in regards to a benefits scandal to do with benefits payments. And for the last 4 nights, they've been rioting over lockdown conditions that have been imposed by the Dutch government in regards to controlling the pandemic. And there's a 9 p.m. curfew, and for the last 4 nights, there's been riots in a whole host of Dutch towns and cities. The last time Holland had a curfew was in the Second World War, between 1940 and 1945, when a certain Nazi Germany had occupied the country. So this is a new thing for Dutch people, a very new thing. They, haven't reacted very, very well to it. So there's that. I've been asked, what my favorite films are, my favorite video games, favorite TV shows. Yeah. And I've been asked a lot of political questions about my views on certain points in history and certain current events and my views on them. Now, I try and stay apolitical. I don't support a particular political party, although I have voted for the 3 main British political parties since 2010. Actually, since 2008, I think, at the first election. I think it was a local election that I voted. So I voted for the 3 main national parties here in the UK at various points. And now I've got to the point where I don't trust any of them, and I don't vote. Well, I do vote, but I always vote for the independents. The last election I voted for an independent, so an independent candidate. I don't feel that the main political parties really are representing the people very well. But yes, I'm going to be very interested to see what questions people, because it is a Q&A. So please whack your questions in the comment section while I make myself a very unhealthy roll-up cigarette, because smoking's bad, so don't do this, kids. If you are under the age of 18 in the UK, or under the age of legal smoking age anywhere in the world, don't do it. But yeah, there's a lot of topics that I've been asked my views on over the years on the main channel. Some of them are quite funny. There was one particular comment in a live stream where a new viewer joined the stream, and this is the other channel, the Sports Boffin is a sports channel, and it was in 2018. And he asked my views on Donald Trump. An hour and a half later, I think he understood my views on Donald Trump and the American political system. And I wasn't too quite keen on the Democrats either. I might have given a bit of a rant. And then the following night, a different viewer asked a similar question on what my views were on the American political system. The viewer who had asked the Trump question said, "Don't go there. Trust me, just watch last night's live stream between this point and this point, and you understand why you don't want to go there." It was quite funny. I went on a lengthy rant about the state of US politics back in 2018. So this is before the last 12 months of shit show that we've seen in the US. But yeah, I'm more than happy to take some questions. So get your questions in. I'll be very interested to see what viewers this evening have to say. Now, pop up chat, because sometimes the chat doesn't work. Yeah, sometimes the chat doesn't work, so sometimes I have to pop out the chat, which is a real pain in the arse. Okay, use the options then. What the? Okay, got that. Okay, so we've got a sports question. Even though I wanted this to be a non-sports live stream, but we've got a sports question, and I will answer it. Have Chelsea got the worst owners out of the big teams? Well, That is a very interesting question. Normally, I would say no sports on this, but actually, because Abramovich has links to the Russian government, this is actually quite a pertinent question in modern sport. Roman Abramovich is an interesting character. He made his money out of being an oligarch, so the collapse of the Soviet Union, which I will get onto with later topics as well, because I've had a few ideas. I went on my walk to the shops, but I've had a few ideas floating around this brain of mine. 10 permanent managers since 2000, and I think was it 2003, 2002. He bought the club 18 or so years ago, and its average manager lasts about 1.8 years, so 18 months, 18 to 20 months. Lampard has lasted about average. If you work out how long Abramovich has owned the club and how many full-time managers have been employed by that club, it works out at 1.8 years. So have Chelsea got one of the worst owners? There's no patience there. There's no it's you must win now. You must get results straight away. And unfortunately, a lot of other clubs are going down the same route. I think the Glazers at Man United again, their time in charge, a lot of debt, which is not necessarily good considering we're going through the biggest financial crisis alongside the biggest economic crisis the world has ever seen, definitely since the war. Yeah. But I want to try and avoid the sports questions unless it's linked to politics or social stuff like that, because there's a few political scandals that involve sport and corruption. Obviously, look, I've got mates who are Chelsea fans. I've got subscribers who are Chelsea fans on the main channel. By the way, get your friends. It's more of a non-sports stream. This is the History Channel, so this channel is dedicated to non-sporting topics. Although Abramovich is very interesting because he does have links to the Russian state. He made his money out of former state assets with his gas and oil company. No, it's fine because I can link Abramovich into Russian politics. It's quite easy. He obviously he's now changed his citizenship to Israeli, so he can retain his British visa because there was a diplomatic incident following on from the Novichok incident in Salisbury a couple of years ago. Seriously, get your friends to watch the stream and get your friends involved because I want to grow this channel a little bit. I've neglected this channel over the last 6 months. I have to admit that. I will say this with Abramovich, though, I will hark back to Abramovich. He made his money out of the collapse of the Soviet Union with the natural reserves of oil and gas and other industries as well that Russia has. And in the early 2000s, he wanted to buy a football club. That football club happened to be Chelsea. Chelsea were a club that had massive financial problems for decades. Oh God, I should have, but I would have probably got taken down by YouTube. My views on American politics, I will get to them. You have to watch on my original streams on the main channel before I started this channel up in 2018. My early videos on this channel do actually have a political element to them. Going back in 2017, I was in a very bad place, and drug and alcohol problems. Yeah, I battled them. I'm not going to be a liar and say I'm a saint, but I was going through a bad period mentally, and I was recovering from a motorcycle crash, and a good friend of mine passed away the year before. I was in a bad place, and the early videos are just a grumpy 20-something rambling on the internet, and and then I found out sport was pretty good and not as divisive as politics. The American election. I mean, Biden's only been in office for 6 days. 6 days he's been in office, so it's not really a gauge on how he's doing as president. Not really a gauge there. But crikey, the last 4 years, I try and keep politics off the main channel as much as possible. It's too divisive. My view on the Democrats and my view on the Republicans is exactly the same. I wouldn't, if I was an American voter, I would vote independent. AOC, who the hell? If it was an option, I'll put on AOC. Look, I don't know what AOC stands for. I'm not gonna lie. My view on American politics is I've studied it. Oh yes, that what's the name? I have forgotten her name. It'll be interesting to see what happens with Biden's 4 years, whether he even lives. Well, he's the oldest president, I think, or the second oldest president after Trump. Cortez, that's the one. I don't know. I mean, we've had our first black president, we've got our first female vice president, and it's the Democrats, ironically, who have achieved these goals, much like the Conservatives in England, with the first two female prime ministers being Conservative, which is very, very interesting, considering that originally the Democrats were more right wing than the Republicans, and there was a shift in the 70s. There was a shift. Yes, they do. Pre 1960, they would like you to forget the fact they owned all the slaves and most of the land in the South, which is why a lot of Southerners who weren't slaveholders and a lot of actual free blacks actually fought for the Confederacy. But don't let the liberal elite let you tell anything different. I actually have books on the American Civil War. I studied it at A-level history. I did it as my coursework, did it as my dissertation. Yes, the Democrats were the slaveholders. They were the ones who made a lot of money investing in the South during the previous 100 years. So when it was colonialism and then the War of Independence, what became the Democrat Party invested in southern plantations. And in the 1820s, they were losing money and slavery was dying out. And then the cotton gin, which is a machine that removes the seeds from the cotton bud, was invented. And the freemen and well, the subsistence farmers couldn't afford such equipment. And the plantation owners realized that they didn't have enough people to maintain the production, and therefore slavery increased because it was cheap labor. That's it. It was a labor-intensive job. Which is interesting, though. Yes, the first founding fathers of the KKK were Democrats. I mean, you got Kentucky, which was a neutral state. Virginia split in two, and parts of Maryland and Missouri had Confederate sympathizers, mostly with Democrats. The Republican, I mean, remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. He emancipated the slaves. But what we see is pre-1960, the Democrats weren't very successful. They really weren't. The majority of politicians were Republican in the first half of the 20th century. The Democrats were struggling, and then Kennedy comes along with a few other, key figures, and their direction changed. They realised they needed the black vote in order to win. It's true. It's true. The Republican Party is just as divided. It's the same with the Conservative and Labour parties in the UK on the question of European Union membership. In the 70s, the Conservatives were all for it, and the Labour Party was heavily split. Hence why we got the Social Democratic Labour Party, those pro-European Labour members, and the Liberal Party were dying, and they formed together a coalition pact in the early 80s, and then it became the Liberal Democrats in 1988. So political parties shift their position on many things. You also have to look at history. Reagan, Republican. Both Bushes, Republican. Trump, were Republican. And the Republicans would rather Trump hadn't been president, to be brutally honest, because it's actually made them less electable than more electable. It is interesting, but a lot of people don't want to really study history. It's become very politicized, which is a problem. University has. I've had many a debate like this down my old local with a lot of like-minded individuals who are pretty pragmatic when it comes to their approach to politics and all that. I'm very apolitical. Apolitical is a term we don't support a political party. Obviously, when I was a teenager in my early 20s, I supported the Lib Dems. Yes, he has. Well, you say he's the most liked president. You say that, but at the same time, the issue surrounding the move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem has not necessarily gone down well with a lot of people. It's very inflammatory. If anyone knows the history of the Middle East since 1948 and before, there was a thing called the Balfour Declaration in 1917, which was aimed at destroying the Ottoman Empire. Basically, we wanted to win the First World War, and the Ottomans were allied with the Axis power, the Central Powers, which was Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and then obviously the Kaiser's Germany. And obviously, we were fighting a campaign in the Middle East, and obviously the war was not yet won. America hadn't actually joined the war at this point, but the Allies came up with. Well, I will get to the invasion of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which is a complicated issue because there's several conflicts before that in the 90s and the early 2000s, which lead to that point. What basically happened in 1917 was the Balfour Declaration. Then, when there was the Zionist uprising in Israel, there was some rules drawn out about the UN mandate in Palestine, which basically stated the original borders of Israel, which are a lot smaller than they are now, was the Israeli state, and the Palestinians, which is basically the West Bank and Gaza. Really, bear in mind you've got Jordan, Egypt, and Syria in this area as well. They would have Palestinian lands like the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and Gaza would in theory, go to the Arab alliance. And what the Israelis did over a period of time up to the 70s was there was a lot of conflict, and Jordan was the first Middle Eastern country out of the Arab League to agree that Israel exists as a country. They decided to take a different political stance because it ensured stability between Jordan and Israel in regards to the West Bank. The Jordanians aren't necessarily happy that the West Bank is still technically occupied by Israel to a point, even though there is a Palestinian Authority control there. But it's complicated. And then Hosni Mubarak, who was a military dictator in Egypt, alongside Anwar. I think Anwar has President Anwar as well. There was a couple of Egyptian presidents who then decided to sign some peace accords, which basically said all we want is Sinai back, because the Israelis took Sinai for a little bit. We want that back. The last stumbling block is Syria. Now, obviously, what's happened with Syria in the last 10 years is descended into anarchy and chaos, and every Sunni, Shiite, Christian, Alawite, you name it, every sect of Christianity and Islam is basically trying to blow Syria to hell as quickly as it can be arranged. And it's still going on regardless of the pandemic. They're still blowing each other up. And that's a different kettle of fish. But the Golan Heights was seized by Israel in the I think the Yom Kippur Six-Day War, and it's been held as a demilitarized zone ever since. It's a little valley, basically, with some hills around it. And there's lots of mines there. So you don't want to be a goat herder in the Golan Heights because you'll blow up. I think I can talk about Iran and what was Persia pre-1979 in great detail because my granddad actually went, when he was a member of parliament, yes, my granddad, who is now since no longer with us as of last summer, was a member of parliament in the 70s, and he was part of a trade delegation to what was Persia, the Shah of Iran, in 1973-74. And because Iran's got oil and other natural resources as well. And Iran has been a key player in the region for centuries. And they're Shiite, so it's a counterbalance to Saudi Arabia. We can have a look at Iran. What happened in 1979 was, here's the problem. America likes supporting despotic dictators. The Soviet Union also in the 60s, 70s, and 80s liked supporting despotic dictators. This is a superpower proxy war because the Soviet Union and the Americans didn't particularly want to launch nuclear warheads at each other, and we would sort of side with America because we had nuclear subs. The French, again, a nuclear power very openly. We have nuclear weapons. The Chinese, the nuclear powers don't tend to like pointing missiles at each other because it makes normal people shit their pants. And the civil servants who really run the countries don't really want to go, Mr. Prime Minister, Mr. President, do you mind not pressing the fucking button? We want to live beyond next week. Because mutually assured destruction was the policy that Kennedy came up with after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Khrushchev was a bit of a nutter as well. And so we don't want to have another Cuban Missile Crisis. We have got close a couple of times. Basically, in order to answer that point, about Iran is a crucial player. It really is. Because in 1979, when they overthrow the Shah, and he ends up, I think, in Paris, I believe, as an exile. I think he spent some time in the US as well. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard and the Ayatollahs take over. And obviously, there's that film with Ben Affleck in it, where they actually disguise the diplomats as a film crew. Yeah, that actually did happen. The Iranian hostage siege, we had the Iranian embassy siege in London where the SAS became a very publicly known thing. We tried to be very secret about our special forces, and then obviously they went into the Iranian embassy and and started shooting people, and stuff blew up. And that was on live TV, and the American networks went mad for it. Um, Iran is a crucial player because of the Straits of Hormuz. 70% of Saudi Arabia's oil exports, and Qatar, Bahrain, UAE, Oman. Oman and Iran are the two countries that control the Straits of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf. The Iranians are the bigger military power. The Omanis, they're allies with us. They're not overly fond of Saudi Arabia, mind. Just putting it out there. The Omanis are not overly keen on their Arab neighbours, but they're pretty peaceful people. They have been since the 70s. There's been no political issues in Oman. They're one more forward-thinking Arab states. Not a lot of Westerners know about Oman, but I don't know a fair bit. Oman is a pretty stable country in the Middle East. Iran is a pretty militant, happy country across the Straits of Hormuz. Now, Oman, their sect of Islam is completely different to Shiites and Sunnis. They have a different sect of Islam. It's a bit more relaxed. It's less strict in a lot of their religious rules. Very important. And they control the Straits of Hormuz with the Iranians. However, if the Iranians want to shut that, the Omani side is a lot smaller, because of territorial waters and the size of their navy being the size of a couple of gunboats. And the Iranians have the power to shut down one of the biggest oil exporting and trade routes in the world. Like that. They can do it. What is stopping them from doing it is the US have a massive, massive, massive base in Qatar. That's why they don't do it. Because there's this US base just across the Gulf from Iran. Iraq and Iran went to war in the 70s and 80s. It's called the Iraq-Iran War. It's about a decade of pointless trench warfare with tanks and planes and Scuds. That killed hundreds of thousands of people, and no one thinks about it because guess what? Saddam Hussein was sponsored by the West. Yes. Those chemical weapons we couldn't find? Yeah, he used them on the Kurds in 1988. So when we get back to the Iraq War in 2003, we have to go back 2 decades to go, where's all the chemical weapons gone? Oh, yes, Saddam Hussein's used them because the Iranians give more rights to the Kurds. There's a big Kurdish community in northern Iran, and they make up the officer corps of the Republican Guard. So these Kurds have been pretty fighty since the Ottoman days, and they like, well, killing people. Because the Kurds... if you're having a flare up in the Middle East, you want to have some Kurdish mercenaries on your side because they will shoot everyone. Technically, the Kurdish homeland is eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, and parts of northern Iran and bits of Azerbaijan and Armenia. That's the Kurdish homeland, in a nutshell. The Kurds in Iran, they get on pretty fine because they're mostly Muslim. There's a few Christians, a few Jews, but even the Jewish Kurds don't particularly like Israel. And they get along because, they are pretty hardened fighters, and the Iranian military, that makes up their backbone of their officer corps. Just saying. The Kurds are kind of important to Iran, so they're given a lot of autonomy in their region. They're allowed to get on with their lives, and they're pretty good fighters to have in your army and your air force and your navy because they're hard bastards. The Iraqi Kurds aren't overly keen on rule from Baghdad, and they haven't been since 1988 when Saddam Hussein gassed them all. The Syrian Kurds, well, they're an offshoot of the Iraqi Kurds via the Iranian Kurds, and they don't like Turkey either because the Turks have been trying to ethnically cleanse them since the 70s. But no, the Kurds don't technically have a nation to call their own. They should do. The Iranians love the Kurds. There's no real problems there, but it's when you get to Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, that's where they get a bit more militant. And the Iranian Kurds and Iran are actually funding this militancy because it destabilizes powers that the Iranians don't like, which is a Sunni-controlled Iraq, which was Saddam Hussein, Turkey, which is a bigger player when it comes to being an ally of NATO, which is very anti-Iran, by the way, and Syria, which is just a shit show because it has been, and they're Arabs. So the Iranians don't like that, and they're Alawites, which is a different sect of Islam altogether, and that is a massive pain in the arse to explain to someone who doesn't understand Islam. So basically, if you were to get an average American and you were to put them in front of all the different sects of Islam, they wouldn't be able to tell them apart. They really wouldn't. Anyway, back to Saddam Hussein being sponsored by the West for a decade. Because of what happened in Iran, the US shit their pants, and they were like, oh god, we need to have a counterbalance in the region, so we're going to start giving this guy who's a military dictator in Iraq loads of funds, so we're going to supply him with weapons and guns and stuff. He's got lots of oil. We like oil. We've had an oil crisis because of Iran and all that. There was 2 oil crises in the 70s where fuel prices rocketed in the US, and the Americans shit their pants because they like their gas guzzling cars. So they basically start, sponsoring Saddam Hussein for a little bit. And then Saddam Hussein does a few things that the UN go, that's a bit naughty, can't really do that. And America being a bit under now, Reagan's gone in '88 and George Bush is now in charge, senior, the smart one, the one who actually had a brain, not GW, because, him. And they realised, oh God, the Middle East is becoming a little bit more untenable and uncontrollable. Oh Christ, we have a problem. Because if Israel and Egypt, Syria, and Jordan wasn't enough of a headache, I know where we're going to have a lunatic in Baghdad. And then what Saddam Hussein did was he invaded Kuwait, and that's where things change. So between '88 and 1990, Saddam Hussein fell out of favour with the US, and because communism was collapsing, it was seen we don't really need this buffer state anymore because of what was happening in Afghanistan. We don't really need that. And then he went into Kuwait, and that sort of started 2 decades of chaos, or 3 decades of chaos now. The invasion of Kuwait by Iraq happened when I was like not very old. I was a year old at the time, and my dad was actually in the army at the time, so my mum was having kittens because obviously we got involved in the first war against Iraq in 1990, 1991, and some of my dad's colleagues went over to Iraq and died. So there is that. And being an army brat, obviously with what was happening in the Middle East and the Gulf, has an impact on us in the army base in Germany. There were British soldiers who were activated and deployed overseas, deployed into Saudi Arabia, that had been based in Germany on overseas deployment, and that does create a bit of consternation when it comes to an army family, because you don't know if your dad or your mum's going to come home alive. That's pretty much what happens, and that did put a strain on my parents' marriage a little bit. It's complicated. But yeah, so obviously the first invasion of Iraq, and then there was economic sanctions imposed after the first Iraq war in '91, which then led to Saddam Hussein getting a bit, angry, and a bit more destabilization. And then we had the '99 bombing campaign against Iraq, because there was breaches of some of the UN protocols that were put in place. There was some concerns that regime change. So Clinton's administration were the ones who signalled, yeah, we're going to go in and we're going to do a bombing campaign against military targets in Iraq. Clinton gets voted out of office, so Al Gore doesn't win the election, and George Bush, comes in. And of course, we know what happened on 9/11, and we'll get to the Afghanistan bit in a section because that's hilarious. Because another US former trade ally turns against them, because it just boggles your mind. And of course, we now know what's happened in Afghanistan and Iraq since then, because they're all linked. But yes, Iraq and Iran would not work as a modern nation. It worked with the Persian Empire for thousands of years, because that's pre one monotheistic religion. It worked for a very long time with the Islamic caliphates in the 6th century, but then you have the diversion between Shiites and Sunnis, and they don't like each other very much. And Iran is the home of the Shiites, and the rest of the Arab world is predominantly Sunni. It's complicated. It's like Protestants and Catholics. Their wars of religion are still ongoing now. Our wars of religion ended in the 1700s because we know it. It's a thing. Al Gore, yes, Al Gore, he sort of disappeared from the public consciousness somewhat over the last 2 decades. He's still actively involved in politics, but that election in 2000 is very, very interesting. This is when Putin's now got power in Russia for the first time, and Yeltsin resigns on New Year's Eve, I believe, of 1999, died a few months later. But Putin takes over from Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin is a hilarious character. I came up with Boris Yeltsin drinking game when I was a bit of a pisshead, and when I occasionally have a drink with my mates, I re-invoke the rules, and it gets very drunk. But I can talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union and what we have now with Putin in charge, and the various ex-Soviet republics like Kazakhstan and Belarus. Belarus is the only country since the collapse of communism to keep the same leader out of the former Soviet republics. Really interesting with Belarus. It's a really complex situation over in Minsk, which is why they don't have the World Championship ice hockey, by the way. Nothing to do with the COVID. It's to do with their leader, Lukashenko. He's a lunatic. He is the last European dictator, quite literally. Putin's kind of nice compared to him, but that's another thing entirely. Al Gore, yeah, he lost that election and then faded from the Democrat kind of hierarchy very, very quickly. And we've got 8 years of Bush. And you could argue that the current state of play is because of the financial crisis, the Iraq War, the Afghan War dragging on for eternity, because the Soviets tried it for a decade. And the Soviets could do a fair bit because of the Iraq-Iran war as well. The Soviets went into Afghanistan in 1979. They left 10 years later, and within 2 years, their country had broken up into multiple, I think, 13 Soviet republics. And then within 5 years of that, you had the first Chechen war, which was a bloody mess, and you had the breakup of Yugoslavia. Because communism stopped being fashionable in 1989 to 1991. It became less fashionable to be a communist and a bit more fashionable to be a right-wing nationalist lunatic in Eastern Europe. It became a bit more fashionable to go, we've given up with the left wing, we'll go over to the right wing and start ethnically cleansing each other, because that is a thing. And I've been to the former Yugoslavia, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful country. It's just crazy people, pretty much. Oh god, I love these live streams. It's not sport related. I can rant a bit. Yes, Al Gore became very irrelevant very, very quickly. Interesting tonight, he was Bill Clinton's vice president during the entire time, and obviously he got given the Democratic nomination. And it was a very close run thing, very, very close run thing. But you could argue a lot of the issues we have today are a direct result of what happened in 2007, 2008 with the financial crisis. This is where a lot of the average bloke like you or me feels very disheartened and disenfranchised with the political system and the economic system that we have. It doesn't matter if you're left wing or right wing. There is a breakdown in trust with people running the countries and people living in them, us, the citizens, the voters. So in my lifetime, in my working adult life, we've lurched from crisis to crisis. We've gone from the banking crash 2007, 2008, which started actually in 2007. There were signs towards the end of Bush's time in charge and Tony Blair's time in charge of the UK. And you can like Jacques Chirac in France, and I think it'd be either Prodi or Berlusconi was in charge of Italy. So some of these big European powers and North America and the US, there were signs brewing at that point, way before the actual crash itself, that things were going wrong quickly. And I've watched documentaries and read articles on this to my heart's content, because I was actually at sixth form college at the time, and I was studying politics. I was about to start studying politics back in 2006, 2007. My first day of paid work at my local supermarket at Tesco's was the day Northern Rock collapsed. Now, this is a small bank in the big scheme of international banking. And when that went belly up, it went belly up very, very quickly. But in real terms, Northern Rock, I patch it back. Northern Rock was small fry compared to what happened the following 12 months later. It was completely small fry. It was a pinprick of a one-off failure, people believed, that the general public believed. But some economists were going, there's something going on here. If a successful bank in the previous 3 decades of rampant wage growth and rising living standards can go belly up so quickly. And Northern Rock had been a success story from a regional bank that had, a national imprint. It was one of the smaller banks, but it had a national imprint in the UK. The fact that a bank could go bust so quickly showed there were things going wrong. I think the way the UK government handled the Northern Rock collapse gave them a bit of a nightmares for what happened, but they learned from it a year later. So when the bigger banks, the real big banks, RBS, Lloyds, Barclays, when they started having massive problems, HSBC and all that, a year later, the government had learned from the mistakes of Northern Rock. But I do believe the Northern Rock collapse did hurt the Labour Party at the time, which was the governing majority party in the UK, very, very badly. But that's another thing. I mean, if Al Gore had won, we don't know where the world would have been. I think the US would probably signed up to more climate treaties like Paris and Kyoto a lot quicker. I think they would have been more amenable to signing up to emissions caps, and I think renewable energy, hydroelectricity, nuclear energy would have been more on the forefront. Less fracking, for example, in the US. But it didn't happen. What we ended up getting was a Republican Party that initially, in the first year or so of being in, wasn't actually that bad. it honestly wasn't that bad. George Bush gets in, and you know, it's not the end of the world. However, where was George Bush governor? Texas. What is there a lot of in Texas? Oil and gas. Yeah, he was governor of Texas, proper redneck state. Now, Texas is one of the two biggest economic states in. If you take well, of the three biggest states economically, were California, New York, and Texas. The difference between Texas and California is Texas can sustain itself as an independent country. California can't. California is bankrupt. California's got problems, which is interesting because Schwarzenegger was the last Republican governor of California, and he actually was the governor was pretty decent. The reason why Schwarzenegger couldn't be president, he wasn't born in the US as part of the Constitution. He had to be born in the United States to be US president, and that's where when Trump does the election campaign was questioning. You know, Obama was born in Hawaii. Hawaii has been a US state since 1958. Yeah. But yes, Al Gore became very relevant very, very quickly. But it is interesting how the Democrats went from a very popular figure in Al Gore, very, very popular, to Hillary Clinton, the ex-president's wife, as one of their candidates to stand against Trump. I mean, if they'd gone for someone else, I think they would have won that election against Trump. The reason why Trump comes along is because of 2008. And the handling of the banking collapse, not just in the US, but around the world. Two countries dealt with the financial downturn very, very well. And you'll be surprised with the two countries that came out of the banking crisis the best. Australia, which avoided recession entirely, and Canada. The Canadians did quite well. What then happens in Europe is exceptionally interesting. Europe is exceptionally interesting because we've had the Eurozone crisis for the best part of a decade, and it hasn't gone away. It's just been controlled by Frankfurt, which is one of the reasons why we get Brexit. The reason why the UK lurches to the right politically is because of 2008. 2007, 2008. It leads to a massive shift. Same in France, same in Holland. Italy, to a certain extent, there's a big shift to the polarising left and right. Now, the Greeks have tried a very, very, very left-wing government, and that didn't work when the Eurozone crisis really got bad. Germany and Holland are very interesting because there's been a big shift to the right wing. France, the second biggest party in France is the Front National. That tells you something. The difference between European politics and British and American politics is a lot of coalition governments. A lot of coalition governments, and that's not stable governance. And what you need in a crisis is stable governance. The issue with the UK is we haven't had stable governance since the coalition government. Irony in that. We currently have an incompetent government, which was preceded by a minority government, which is no way to govern a country. And having lived in Germany, a country known for its coalition governments, and having spent a lot of time in Italy, known for its short governments, where they can have 6 governments a year, in fact, and their current coalition is on the verge of collapse again, because that's a thing, you know. It's a thing. But no, what is interesting is yeah, we've covered a lot of topics, and I've sort of linked them all together, and they are all linked because the massive military spending as well in the 2-3 decades leading up to the financial crash of 2008 has an impact as well. Social services, while they were getting social care system, social services, unemployment, they were getting funding. They weren't getting enough. We weren't saving enough money for bad times. What we've had for the last 12 years is bad times. Not enough prudent saving by governments. Massive overspend, which has led to a debt crisis. Reckless spending without working out. We're spending more than we're earning, which is a thing. Whether Al Gore would have gone to war in Iraq is another thing. Afghanistan was going to happen regardless. Al Qaeda was actually originally funded by the CIA in the 70s and the 80s to fight the Soviets. My enemy's enemy's my friend policy. Yeah, that's what that's all about. The CIA trained the Mujahideen, or helped fund the Mujahideen, in order to fight the Soviets. The Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan before the communist government in Kabul collapsed. What we then get is 6 years of uninterrupted, the Taliban take control. And then you've got the Northern Alliance, which are also pretty brutal people as well. The Taliban didn't fully control Afghanistan. They were the de facto government. Much like the communist government of the previous decade, they didn't fully control the country. Vast tracts of Afghanistan is held by tribal leaders because there's no centralized government that's effective enough to keep all people happy. It's a fact, it's a known thing. But I'm interested in other questions because, politics is one thing, and I can argue about the state of politics today, what's happening right now. Yes, Al Gore has become very irrelevant, very, very quickly. But you look at the amount of leaders who no one really gives a toss about. There were some very, very interesting politicians in the 80s and 90s who were still active, who are on the periphery now, who we desperately need back in the forefront, but they're not going to get it because, they're on the edges of their parties or the political spectrum now. And Al Gore wasn't necessarily, how do I put this, photogenic enough, media friendly enough. The media didn't really give him much of a chance. And there were certain things with the Clinton administration, including his impeachment, that did damage the American confidence in the Democrats at that time. There's a reason why they decided we've had enough of Clinton's Democrats, and Al Gore would be an extension of that. We want to change. And the Monica Lewinsky scandal, I think, did for Al Gore. I think that's one of the reasons why he didn't get elected, was the fact he was vice president when his president, his boss, was impeached. That is a problem. So there was a lack of trust with the Democrats because they tried to cover up the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It highlighted flaws similar to Watergate with Nixon, where there was a breakdown in trust with the populace, people, and the government. And then Obama comes along. And I remember I was studying politics at A-level and we were discussing Obama. And it was very surprising in 2004 when Al Gore didn't run for the Democratic ticket. Very surprising. It was also surprising that he didn't try again, but Hillary Clinton ran for president on the Democratic ticket, and then obviously Obama beat her to that nomination. And you could argue that Obama is not actually as a successful president as people have you believe. Not all Americans benefited from Obama being in charge. The fact that the US government went through several threats of shutdown because government spending they just ran out of money. They were printing money to keep the economy going, which is no way to run an economic policy long term. And then we had several governmental shutdowns during Clinton, Bush. It happens regularly where the federal government runs out of cash and federal employees don't get paid, or they're on reduced pay. It happens. American government finances are a mess. But it's interesting that Al Gore's becoming relevant. There's a lot of hypothetical hypotheses of what happens if he had become president. We just don't know. I do believe America would have possibly, with the Paris Climate Accords that obviously Obama signed up to when he was president, they would have definitely signed up or had a motion to get them signed sooner. Had he won, I think the Kyoto would have been built upon more quickly. In 97, it would have been built upon. However, it didn't happen. So America's playing catch up. But with Biden, it's too early to say whether it will be what he'll be like as president. He doesn't really have any policies. He's just everything opposite of Trump. That's basically his policy, is to be the opposite of Trump. I think his first order of business is to deal with the pandemic. And now we've got vaccines being developed. Get that rolled out. And reopen the economy a lot more cautiously than what Trump did. instead of trying to keep the economy open, try and fix flaws in the system and go from there. But no, I don't want to carry on about this topic. There are other things that I've been asked a lot of questions in regards to films, books, video games, a whole lot of other things. But it's interesting what's happening in America right now because we just don't know what Biden's all about, really. I mean, just because Trump's out of office doesn't mean that the divisions in US society are going to get fixed. I feel that it's going to take a lot longer to fix those problems than people realise. There's a big issue about policing in the US. Big debate right now. I think the debate's been had across the Western world about police powers and where we stand with police brutality and the funding of police forces, the structures in place to avoid corruption and police brutality. Because it's not just against minority groups that police avoid. I'm going to assure you on that. There's a whole host of people who've been battered by the police in custody. It just so happens that if you're of a minority group who gets battered in police custody, it makes more sensational headlines than, okay, we're in a majority white country, and a white youth is beaten or killed in police custody. If it's a minority group, it makes more headlines. It does. But I can tell you now, I have little trust in the police myself, even though I've got a couple of friends who are police officers and a cousin. They're fully. I mean, my mate Matt, he's not on Facebook, which is, I think, a benefit to him. He's not on YouTube either or anything like that. He doesn't really do social media, but he knows my views on policing and how I feel that it's wrong, what happens, and how unaccountable they can be, even though there's laws in place to make police accountable. And he respects my views on that. The fact that at any point he could pull out his warrant card and arrest me for various things in his time as a police officer, he could not. He could have given me a citation for being drunk and disorderly more than once. Possession of cannabis, he could have pulled me over. A whole variety of offences that he's aware that either I or others have committed. Handling stolen goods, possession of drugs. Loads of my friends could have been arrested by my mate Matt. He chose not to. Police with your head. But at the same time, he's aware that since he became a police officer, he's lost a lot of friends because there is that lack of trust in policing and the public. It's a thing. And every negative headline that comes out about excessive force, racial profiling, profiling upon age, gender. So yeah, you're more likely to get stopped if you're a young male than a young female. It's a thing. 75%, I think 70% of crimes are committed by men between the ages of 16 and 35 or something. The 18-30 club dynamic. That's majority of crime is committed by men in that age group. Also, the majority of victims of crime are males in that age group. Doesn't matter what your sexuality or gender is, gender orientation or anything like that, or your ethnicity. If you are in that age group of the 18-30 club, technically 18 to 40, 16 to 40, you're more likely to be a victim of crime or a committer of crime, hence why suspects are profiled in that way. Whether it's right or not, that's a debate that's going on. I've been stopped and searched without cause because I'm, whatever reason, out and I get pulled over by the RBL. I've been strip searched. I've been frisked. I've been pulled over. And yeah, I could have done the police on a variety of things. On an unsafe stop. Because there's a Police and Criminal Evidence Act brought in 1984, which I think a lot of people need to read up on. PACE. It's called PACE. I've been stopped multiple times. Only once did they actually follow it correctly. Only once. And that was in 2008 when I was a barman and I was walking home from my bar job late at night because I had a late shift and I was pulled over. And technically it was classed as an unsafe search. If I was to really push it, it would be classed as an unsafe search. I have been searched under the Misuse of Drugs Act. I have been searched under suspicion of, matching a description. I have been pulled over on my vehicle for, what was it? The description was male riding a motorcycle in the area, vehicle theft, burglary, and possession with intent to supply. When they did the number plate check and I handed over my driving license, they knew straight away I wasn't the guy they were looking for because the vehicle matched my license registration and insurance documents. However, they held me at the side of the road for quite some time. And I mean, this is not a traffic stop because you're not a traffic officer. You are a normal squad car. And I started being a bit of a not a know-it-all, but a pain in the arse in the sense that I knew my rights at this point. They called for backup because they realised I could be a bit difficult. In the end, I got off on an unsafe search because they didn't do the paperwork correctly. And when I actually questioned them about why I was being pulled over by a non-traffic officer, and it wasn't a traffic offence, why am I being pulled over? Such and such and such and such. So, okay, this vehicle is mine. It's insured, it's taxed, it's road legal, it's got an MOT. I've given you details of where I was and the address and the contact details of my friend. He's probably in bed right now. I've been cooperative, but I know my rights. The fact it took 3 police officers to hold there was A, unnecessary, and B, when they worked out who I was, they could let me on my way. They held me for quite some time, which was a pain in the ass. That stop should have taken 5 minutes. It took 25, 30 minutes in the middle of winter in bad weather for them to let me on my way. There was no need for me to be held as long as I was. But that's another thing. Now, I understand why people of a minority background have had a harder time. I get that. The colour of one's skin, people's orientation, their nationality. I get that. There is profiling that takes place that is wrong. But then you've got to put yourself in the police's shoes. Now, I'm not a massive fan of the police, and I do believe there is abuse of police powers that's happening on a daily basis, not only in this country, but in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, anywhere in the Western world. We can talk about some of the nasty countries where you don't want to be stopped by the old bill because they will probably beat you half to death before they get you into police custody. Before they even made the arrest, you've already been beaten and robbed. But in the Western world, yes, you could argue there is a massive issue with profiling, racial profiling as well, gender profiling. So male, if you're male, Afro-Caribbean, and between the ages of 16 and 35, you were 5-6 times more likely to get stopped than me. And I'm more likely to get stopped than a woman in the same age bracket. So there's already gender profiling, which helps with policing. You've got to think, in an area, let's say you're in Cornwall, okay, and there's a spate of crime. Cornwall's boring, nothing happens down there, apart from a few surfers in one warm week and summer go to Newquay to get stoned. But there's not a lot happening in Cornwall. It's technically the poorest part of the UK because all the big mining industries have gone and they're heavily reliant on tourism. And of course, in the last 12 months, tourism has gone down the toilet. So what do you think is going to happen in Cornwall? It's an interesting one. So you're a Devon and Cornwall Constabulary police force that covers Cornwall. It also covers Devon as well. Now, Devon is a bit different because you've got naval base in Plymouth. You've got MOD facilities on Dartmoor. There's a lot of Army, Navy and Air Force personnel down in Devon. A lot. There is an issue with crime and military bases that happens on a regular basis. Squaddies like drinking. Squaddies like prostitutes. Squaddies can be a bit of a rough bunch with the locals. Locals and squaddies don't always get along. And being born in an army base and living in an army base for 3 years, and I have lots of mates and relatives in the armed forces. I should know that because I've been in a few pub fights with them, and I know they can handle themselves. This is the thing. So if you are a police officer in Devon and Cornwall Constabulary, you're on your beat, let's say in rural Devon or Cornwall, there's not a lot of crime down there, really. Not really. In comparison to Bristol, unless you're near one of the military establishments. So you're going to look at men of military age, which, guess what, is the 18-30 group. Most men of military age and women are in their 17 to 30 group. That's most of your military age, which is the rough and tumble. So you're going to get a lot of drunk and disorderly, a lot of assault, crimes around military areas, drunk, disorderly, public intoxication, which is a different offence altogether, even though it's run all got the same thing, drink driving, and assaulted alcohol-related crimes, especially in city and town centres. Other than that, not a lot happens in Devon and Cornwall. So when you do have a spate of unusual crimes such as car theft, drug dealing, burglary, you have to go, okay, who's committing these crimes? And the murder rate's really low. So then that's a police force who've got to handle things that don't normally happen. Go to Bristol, for example, which is not that far up the road from Devon and Cornwall. It's completely different. There's a lot of drug dealing. There's a lot of burglary. There isn't a murder rate. There is deprivation, in the sense that Bristol's a big city in comparison to the population centres in Cornwall, for example. And there's more minority groups. There's more deprived areas, in the sense that wealthy areas and really poor areas. Drug crime, burglary, your common vehicle theft, arson, your general street gangs. There's a lot of drug dealing, not just possession of, but actually dealing the drugs. And it's a different type of policing. And again, you have to go, oh, who's doing this? Oh, it's the 1830 group again. Yeah, it's profiled. Rural crime is different. Rural crime is different from urban crime. And the same can be said in the US. You just look at the stats of who commits the crime. The incarceration rate is another thing entirely. I mean, US has got a stupid incarceration rate for percentage of population. I mean, I think a third of the prisoners in the US shouldn't be in prison, because there would be classed as minor offences over in other countries in the Western world. So that tells its own story. Far too many people in the US are in prison. And that's another thing with what we'll see with Biden. We may see a change in arrest rates. We may see a possibly drop in crime rates. We may see more legalisation of cannabis. We may see less offences resulting in criminal conviction, as in more like civil penalties, fines, community service, more sentencing in the community, because the prison system in the US is a mess. But yeah. Any other questions, though? Because we've gone on about social problems quite a bit. I'll be very interested to see what other questions people have. Because, yeah, I mean, you start with a sports question, which is really interesting. And I can go back to Abramovich and how he made his money really easily. And it is to do with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which links into a lot of the questions which result in, what happens with the Gulf War. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant a lot of these countries lost their sponsor and stability in the Soviet Union for economic aid. And that when you have an economic crisis, conflict arises over resources, money. You've got to keep the people distracted. Very interesting. It's the same with Yugoslavia, except Yugoslavia is a bit different because they broke the Soviet Union in alliance and sided more with the West under Tito, which is very interesting. It's more of an ethnic conflict rather than a political one. But it had ramifications over here. And the Clinton administration was actively involved with NATO, with the UN, with the Dayton Accords in '95. Clinton's administration is very, very interesting with its foreign policy. Because at the same time, you've got the Dayton Accords in '95, you've got the Black Hawk Down. It's a great film, based on the real events that happened in Somalia in the mid-90s as well, where Clinton sent Delta Force and the Rangers in and tried to stabilise the situation in Mogadishu. And that went, well, tits up, because it's still a bloody mess now. It's been a bloody mess for 30 years. America and intervention in the Muslim world doesn't go well, apart from Bosnia. Just putting it out there. And Kosovo doesn't go so well. Really doesn't. I don't know what that is. America intervening in predominantly Muslim nations as having a bit of a tits up doesn't go very well. Really interesting, that. I should do a comedy skit. I almost came up with an idea of doing drunk history with my mate Milton, which nearly came about, actually, when this channel first started. I came up with the idea, let's do some drunk history, except I'm doing energy drink history right now. Because I was going to dress as a German officer and he's going to dress as a Russian or a British officer. We were going to get progressively more drunk and take the piss out of communism and fascism, but it didn't come about. Yeah, it would have been really hilarious. Really hilarious. But no, I'm interested in what other questions you have, because obviously the Al Gore situation, the world could have been a much different place. But at the same time, there was a lack of trust. But yeah, I'm very interested to see, like, obviously what other questions people have. So get other questions in there. Get your questions down. I'm going to have another drink, because I need another energy drink. That's really interesting. Right. Right, back. Supplies. I should get sponsored by these guys. But no, yeah, the situation right now, let's just check the news headlines. Now, obviously, I'm going off British news headlines here. Let's have a look at BBC News. Not that I actually trust BBC News anymore, but well, it's on my homepage, so it's easy just to click. I better charge my phone, actually. I've no idea. I was in phone battery. Right, Boris Johnson's on his press conference about getting out of lockdown. Schools in England will return at March at the earliest. Ooh, the EU has demanded that AstraZeneca vaccine doses be made here in the UK. That is really interesting. Let's have a little look, because this is something that I think the EU is having an issue with, is sorting out the vaccine situation. Over here, it seems to be working quite well with the vaccine model. We're vaccinating a lot of people, like 100 people a minute or something ridiculous. The EU has urged pharmaceutical firm AstraZeneca, which is a massive pharmaceutical firm, to supply it with more doses of its COVID-19 vaccine from UK. Bear in mind, we've left the EU, right? With it. Amid a row over shortages. Now, the company has infuriated the bloc by saying it can deliver only a fraction of the doses it promised the first quarter of the year. It blames production issues at European plants. That is really interesting. But the EU says doses made elsewhere should make up the shortfall. The EU has been criticised for the slow rollout of its vaccination. Yeah, this is interesting. A confidentiality clause. Well, this is where legal stuff comes in. Binds AstraZeneca from releasing the details of its deal with the bloc, but the company reportedly said last week the EU would get 60% fewer doses promised for the next 3 months. That's January to March. Two sides met for talks. Earlier on Wednesday, the EU official said that AstraZeneca had pulled out of the meeting, but the company has since insisted it will attend, which is interesting. Pfizer BioNTech, which is an even bigger vaccine production deal with the EU, is also experiencing delays. This is really interesting, actually. French drug maker Sanofi has announced that it will help produce 125 million doses by the end of the year. So it's a subsidiary of, it's got an agreement with Pfizer. The company will allow German-based BioNTech to use its facilities in Frankfurt from July. Sanofi said in a statement, having delayed the development of the vaccine. Pfizer says its agreement with Sanofi is just one of several efforts it is making to increase supply by expanding manufacturing facilities and adding suppliers and contract information. Basically, none of the people who signed contracts the EU can deliver, basically. At a news conference, EU Health Commissioner, with a really unpronounceable Greek name, Stella Kyriakidakis, Kyriakides, I think I've butchered that, so that UK's factories which have not experienced problems. So this is weird. We're part of its deal with the company and had to deliver. This is really interesting because obviously we've left the EU as a UK. The 27 European Union member states are united that AstraZeneca needs to deliver on its commitment on our agreements, because they can get fined if they don't deliver the products, by the way. We meet on Tuesday with Italian newspaper La Repubblica, which I have read before. Very good newspaper, actually. AstraZeneca said the contract compelled it to make its best effort rather than obliging to meet a set deadline. Okay. The EU Commission said this characterization of the deal was not correct or acceptable. Basically, the EU signed an advance purchase agreement, blah, 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 blah. In a nutshell, oh, God. Wow. The EU have screwed up here, ironically. They've said the UK and its production sites are to be classed as the primary, and Belgium and Netherlands, which have secondary sites, are classed as secondary. So the EU screwed up a little bit, even though we're leaving the EU or left the EU screwed up, because they should have 50-50. They haven't. Vaccine production issues in Belgium and Netherlands. Wow. What a surprise. basically, the EU have screwed up. The UK did not play part in the EU vaccine scheme, although it could have done it until the end of 2020 while it is still in the Brexit transition period. That's a fuck up on our side. At the time, the government said it was opting out because it felt it wouldn't allow it to continue its own negotiation with potential suppliers and wouldn't have a say on the price following the date of possible delivery. Worked out all right. At the time, it was a bit of a blunder, but it's actually worked out okay, which is very interesting. The UK was the first country in the world to approve the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine and rolled out until which was the EU. And obviously, the Oxford AstraZeneca and the Moderna. So we're actually ahead, which is really surprising. Wow, that's an interesting one. The EU screwed up. Beautiful. Obviously, now travellers, there's travel restrictions in place with flights. Biden signs. Oh, now talking about Joe Biden. Biden signs existential executive orders on the climate and environment. The US President Joe Biden has signed a series of executive orders aimed at to address climate change, including a new ban on some energy drilling. So fracking is in the debate, which actually started under Obama in big amounts. Fracking's been going on for decades, but the orders are aimed to freeze new oil and gas leases on public lands and double offshore wind production by 2030. Right. A series of executive orders that Mr. Biden signed on Wednesday establish a White House Office of Domestic Climate Policy and announced the summit of leaders to be held on Earth Day in April. Mr. Biden has also called on the US Director of National Intelligence to provide an intelligent report on security implications of climate change. What do we do? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, John Kerry's back in the White House. He's a divisive figure as well. Right. Wow. Jobs. Wow. That's interesting. Yeah. Trump. Oh, somebody came to energy policy. Quite a few things actually. Wow, that's quite a bit. Wow. Failing firm soars in value as amateurs buy stock. Wow, what's this? GameStop. Wow, didn't think they were still a store actually. Yeah, that's interesting. Shares in US games company 300%. Video games, bricks and mortar retailer GameStop is arguably something of a relic in the modern world moving online. 120%. Oh, why don't I invest in this? Fucker. Wow. 120% inflation in share price. Jesus, I should have invested on Tuesday after retired today. GameStop, failing mall-based retailer. Whoa, $795 million in losses in 2019. Jeez, that's not deterred an army of social media day traders with access to free and local Australian functions of Robinhood and not done. Wow. BlackBerry, AMC, and Nokia. So basically, failing companies are being in. Wow, this is insane. Jesus, I should really. No, that's right. Wow. Will the UK pubs stay shut till May? Well, let's have a look at some local news. Because local news is funny as hell. Let's have a look at local news. Let's have a look at RG40. Let's go. Berkshire, come on. Well, plans to build a 10 million solar farm, power 4,000. Thames Water plans to create 1,000 jobs where they can fix all the pissing leaks in the road. How to help someone's breathing. Wow. Except Tanner. Oh, to go. I will keep out the sports news. Let's have a look at what's happening locally to me. Local news. Right. Disappeared off the local news section, which is really annoying. Local news. Let's have a look at what's happening locally. Teacher died of COVID. RAF veteran awarded a French military honour. Gas holder to be washed for flat. What's this? Reading Gas. Oh, the old Reading Gas Works. So if you remember the old Reading Gas Works, if you've ever been to Reading in the UK, by the railway line, main line to London. Gas holder number 4. Wow, the last one left. Interesting. Interesting. Huh, very interesting. It's got rain tonight. It's got rain tomorrow. Nah. Non-league clubs. Well, that's interesting. 10 million injection. National League clubs or officials decide whether to proceed. Ooh, wow, that's interesting. If you follow your sport, which I'm assuming someone who's watching this does, National League chiefs are due to speak with the clubs this week on a vote that could scrap the rest of the season. Wow, that's big news. Government has told the league that wow, the National League doesn't want loans; they want grants, and the government's offering them a loan, which they don't want. Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sports announced non-league clubs set 3-6 by National League. Wow. 850 football clubs in the UK have not played in 2 months. That is insane. Right. Long-term low-interest loans will be made available to clubs and national league steps. Well, so maybe sport is common on the agenda. So the British government is offering loans to the non-league football. So if you follow non-league football, but the non-league, National League, doesn't want loans, it wants grants like the rest of the non-league, and that is really interesting. So there is a political debate about lower levels of elite football. So the government is getting involved, which they stated at the beginning of the pandemic they wouldn't. So that has really made things very, very interesting. But yeah, I'm interested to see what other questions people have. Obviously, there is a lot to talk about, but I'll be interested to see what other questions people have. So get them in, get the questions in. It's something that I think needs to happen because the stream really we'd be rambling about stuff, but there's a lot of stuff. Look what we covered. We've covered what questions have been asked. So we started with Chelsea and Abramovich, and then we ended up with Cortez. Could she be the next president? It's possible. Obviously, the Democrats' history and the Republicans' history. If Britain and France joined forces, then the American Revolution would take a very big turn. Well, yeah, but the French have been our traditional enemies until 1815, so that's interesting. Wouldn't have happened. US done cover the invasion of Iraq. I should get a history degree and become a historian or something. I have been debating whether to do an open university degree because I can't actually afford to go to university per se. The Iranian military head that was inspired by America was a good thing. People don't realise the war. Well, yeah, well, the UN has been a pretty toothless organisation with a lot of things. Civil war with Iraq and Iran were one nation. Well, they haven't been one nation for a very long time. Very long time. About 1,000 years, I think. What Iran, what is Iran now is ancient Persia. The borders haven't really changed that much from the Persian heartland. So Iraq and Iran's dominated Iraq historically until obviously after the Second World War occurs. Pacific homeland, and Al Gore became very irrelevant. And I've rambled for a long time, but no, there's some interesting stuff. I mean, if anyone's got any other questions, whack them in the comments section because I'll be interested to see what other people have to ask me because there's a lot going on right now that I think needs to be discussed. If anyone wants to ask me about my views on British politics, that could be a very long discussion. I could be here for hours. But no, I am very, very interested in a lot of things. But no, I remember Al Gore. I remember Al Gore, and how he's disappeared from the conversation over the last 20 years. And I do believe, yeah, things would have been a lot different if Al Gore had been president. Whether they'll be different for the better is another thing. You have to bear that in mind. You have to bear that in mind. Yes, with hindsight, we may not have gone to war with Iraq. That doesn't necessarily mean that Al Gore would have been a better president than George Bush or Obama. It doesn't actually necessarily mean that. We don't know what Al Gore would have been like. We do know, what I can say for certain is US energy policy would have been a hell of a lot different. Hell of a lot different. The Afghan war would have still happened. There would have still been the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan in December. That still would have happened, but other policies more open-ended. I think there would have been a different climate policy by Al Gore. Social policy, that's a difficult one to domestic policy in the US being much more difficult to predict. Would we have had the subprime mortgage crisis? Still most likely. That I think still possibly would have happened, possibly at a later date, ironically. I think it would have taken longer to materialise as a crisis, but I still think with Al Gore, if Al Gore was president, I think the subprime mortgage crisis and what became the financial crash would have happened. I believe that. Whether it would have happened now or when it would have happened, I don't know, because we don't know what 8 years of Al Gore would have given us. Because I believe if he became president, he would have won a second term. But that's with hindsight. And I'm not overly, how do I put this? I'm not an overall expert on every single domestic policy of the US. Ironically, I nearly moved to the US as a teenager with my mum with her job. So had Al Gore become president, I would have been living in Colorado Springs, or Denver. If you follow my main channel, I most likely would have become a Colorado Avalanche fan because I love my ice hockey, and that's the biggest sports team in Colorado. If you take the Denver Nuggets out of there and the Denver Broncos, I most likely would have become an Avalanche fan. But no, I don't know what would have happened with Al Gore if he'd become president. I think foreign policy would have been a lot different with Al Gore. Domestic policy, I don't think there'd be much change from what we've seen from everyone but Trump. I think domestic policy would have stayed pretty similar. You could argue healthcare is becoming more of an issue for the Americans. You could argue the subprime crisis would have still happened. Ironically, when it happens is another thing. That is up for debate. Would it have happened in 2007, 2008, or would it have happened later? I don't think it would happen sooner somehow. I think it would actually happen further down the line. I think the Democrats are a bit more keen on regulation than the Republicans, and I think there would have been a bit more regulation in place, which would have, I think, delayed the subprime crisis. However, I don't think it would have prevented it. But again, that's thinking outside the box. I know US energy policy would have been different and more geared towards renewables and cleaner energy. So American car industry, for example, I think there'd be much tougher emissions regulations brought in and factory emissions levels. I think that is something that I think we can all agree on. Is Al Gore is a bit more environmentally friendly than other US presidents would have been with his policies, what he laid out in the election in 2000. At the same time, that election was so close to call. What we can expect from Joe Biden with his now announced these executive orders, it's Al Gore 20 years later. It really is on that domestic policy front. However, he's playing 20 years worth of catch up. The US are 20 years behind where they should be. Other countries have stormed ahead. Other countries have stormed massively ahead with their energy policies. So that is an interesting topic to discuss. But it is really interesting how he became very irrelevant very, very quickly. He fails to win the White House. And outside the US, a lot of people don't hear a lot about Al Gore. I don't know what it's like in the US. I can't comment on Democratic supporters or just general American citizens what their views are on Al Gore. But to the wider world, Al Gore has sort of slipped down the importance of public figures and those in public office. What we've seen is more interest in Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump. Bernie Sanders is obviously still very, very relevant. He's more relevant politically than I think he should be. Bernie Sanders is Al Gore on steroids for his domestic. Bernie Sanders is Al Gore on steroids. Do you think if Al Gore would have become president, would the world be a better place or a more or different kettle of fish? Yes. Imagine Bernie Sanders as president. He is Al Gore on steroids. And there's a reason why he didn't get the Democratic nomination twice. Twice. He's run for the Democratic nomination to be president. Twice. Fucking twice. And both times he's lost out. That is interesting. Bernie Sanders has run for president twice and hasn't become the party's Democratic nomination to run against the Republican nomination twice. Fucking twice. That tells you something. That generally tells you something. He's a bit too socialist for mainstream America. So if you're a swing voter, if you're an undecided voter who doesn't really have a love for the Democrats or Republicans, a lot of them probably won't choose Bernie Sanders because he's, well, what we would class in Europe, a social capitalist. He wants to have a bit more of a mixed economy. Bernie Sanders would do very, very well in Europe. Very, very well in Europe. He's still right of centre, ironically, because American politics is right wing. there's Democrats who are right wing, and then you have the right of centre, and then you have the Republicans who've lurched completely to the right. So Bernie Sanders would, if he was a European politician, would have been a prime minister or a president decades ago, a long time ago. In America, it's not going to happen. Al Gore is the closest you've got to a president who has socialist ideals on certain things, such as energy policy, military intervention overseas. He's more of a domestic president than a foreign policy president would be Al Gore. You would get more of that with Bernie Sanders. He'd be far more domestic policy based. And that's something that America needs, but they won't go for it. Joe Biden's going to be very, very interesting, though. Because Biden is Al Gore light. I think that's the best way I can describe Joe Biden. I have no other way to describe him. But, you know, for me, I don't know enough about American domestic policy to really have an overall view. But what I see about America is their foreign policy. And this is where America is not very popular. Not very popular at all. So I'll be interested to see what Biden does. Very, very interested, especially in his foreign policy. I know American voters, obviously domestic policy is key for them, obviously like every election, with any country, but their foreign policy is going to be very, very interesting with Biden at the helm. He was vice president under Obama. There was less intervention overseas in terms of actual boots on the ground. Yes, they intervened overseas, but they did it in a different way, a more measured way. It will be interesting to see what emphasis Biden does with their military policy overseas and their diplomatic pressure overseas on countries such as with sanctions, talks, treaties. Very, very interesting. But from what I've seen of the news reports coming out of the US and overseas journalists reporting on Biden in his first few days, he's trying to undo all the Trump policies like that with executive orders. There's only so many executive orders he can get away with. There's lots of domestic policy that, with legislation, needs to be passed by Congress and the Senate, and that's a different kettle of fish. Every president has found the Congress and Senate is a pain in the arse. So it'd be interesting to see how he handles domestic policy. But then we can discuss, Boris Johnson's domestic policy, which is a shambles over here in the UK, absolute shambles. Don't get me started on Trudeau in Canada, because the Governor General situation is a mess. That he's had a fair few scandals, and he's leading a minority government. So Trudeau's going to be very, very interesting. If his government collapses, Canada's going to be in a very interesting position. A position that Canada has not been in for quite some time. Because you've got to keep all the territories and the provinces on side. And there's a lot of debate going on in Alberta and British Columbia about an oil and gas pipeline being built. There's issues with what's going on with the Governor General position and resignation there. And the US-Canadian border still being shut is really, really interesting. Because I've got friends in Canada and the US. So the border being closed is something that we haven't seen between Canada and the US since the War of 1812. Just putting it out there. This hasn't happened since the War of 1812, which actually ended in 1815, but it was mostly fought in 1813 and 1814. But the War of 1812, when war was actually declared between the US and Britain, the US-Canadian border hasn't been closed for 200 years. So, for 205 years actually, but that's something that, because it was actually a front line. So that's something that's really, really interesting, is we're in unprecedented territory here. So what happens in Canada is very important as well. And what happens with Trudeau's government is very, very important, because if that actually falls and there's a snap election, which I don't think is the most likely outcome, but it could happen. It could have massive implications on US foreign policy, because Biden has got to obviously have a decent working relationship with Trudeau, and Trudeau did not have a good relationship with Trump. Justin Trudeau did not have a good working relationship with Donald Trump. So that's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the Canadian-US border issue, with it being closed right now. Because I'm an NHL fan, and if you follow the main channel, you'll know that I love my ice hockey. I love the NHL. And my favourite team is a Canadian team. And we've just made a big trade. And we've signed a player who's playing in the US, and he's got a quarantine. So that is interesting. And the way the Canadians have dealt with the pandemic and the way the US have dealt with the pandemic is a stark difference, massive difference. Yes, you've got the provinces and territories, and very similar to the US states. But the Trudeau government is in a weak position. It's a minority government. There's been a fair bit of scandal around this second term with Trudeau as Prime Minister. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Very interesting. There's a lot of people who don't like Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister in Canada. But I don't see a alternative to Trudeau. From what the reports I'm getting, that can win enough votes to form a government of any kind. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Canada. Also, across the channel from the UK, got Holland. They're in a political crisis right now. It's partly to do with a benefits scandal, to do with benefits payments and incorrect payments and hardship brought to many people. And now the curfew debate in Holland, the Netherlands. That's rumbling on. And so one of the key allies we have on the continent in the Dutch, when it comes to talks between the EU and us, is in crisis. They don't technically have a government. It's a caretaker government. And there's an election in 2 months. And there's riots every night in Holland right now. There's issues with that ongoing. Merkel's coalition government is, well, it's there. We're going to have a new German chancellor soon. Merkel's not standing for re-election. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Germany and who's actually in charge of the governing coalition when that election happens, and if the AfD actually win more seats, because that is really concerning. There's the ongoing issues in Belarus with the opposition and civil disturbances there. You know, there's Italy, their government could collapse. So the EU's got problems, a lot of problems. And all the countries I've mentioned have coalition governments. And they're all key players, because these are big nations in the EU, like Holland, Italy, Germany. These are some of the founding countries of the EU in the Treaty of Rome. All of them have governments that are weakened in their position. They're all going to have new leaders very, very soon. And in one case, the government technically doesn't exist. It's a caretaker government. The people haven't voted for it. It's just there to keep the wheels turning during the crisis. Germany is going to have a new chancellor within the next 12 months. Italy may have a new government by next week because Italy likes governments changing hands every 6 months. So the state of European politics is really interesting. There's a reason why we've only had one coalition government since 1945. And it's actually a pretty successful government in terms of competence compared to other governments that we've had in my lifetime. Just putting it out there. So if you're looking at political history since 1945, Italy's had political turmoil for 80 years. France has had some pretty dodgy times. Germany, obviously, the reunification in 91. Holland is now entering an unprecedented level of political crisis that it hasn't had since 1945. So some of these big players in the European continent are in a mess, and people wonder why Brexit happened. Economically, Europe has done very well since 1945. Politically, it's a mess. Absolute mess. So if you want to ask me some questions on European politics, I've lived on the continent. I can tell you it's a shit show. It's a shower of shit politically. Now, if you want to understand a little bit about Italy, there's a reason why Mussolini was a dictator for 20 odd years. Because pre-World War One, the government was weak, and then post-World War One, the government was a shit show for 3 years or so, and then the March on Rome happened, and then you had Mussolini for 20 years, which, yeah, and then obviously, so they went back to democracy, and they overthrew it. They had a referendum on the monarchy, and they went to a republic. And Italian history post 1946 is really, really interesting. Because there's been a lot of political instability and corruption scandals in Italy that I could go on for days about. Germany's interesting as well. You look at these countries that have had dictatorships, and you could argue Napoleon III being emperor of the French, and then overthrown after 1871, all that. Again, weak government, weak governance. In Germany, the Weimar Republic, really weak governance. Italy, just well, Italy, yeah, not overly stable in government. But ironically, all these countries had these really weak governments and have post World War II have had some really good economic times. It's really weird because industry led the way, not government policy. Because the governments kept changing, but economically, the economies kept growing for 20 years. And then the 70s came along and it all became a shower of shit, and trade unionism took over. Because that's the thing, because strikes are fun. So ask your parents or your grandparents, depending on how old you are, what the 70s were like for trade relations and economic downturns and unemployment, because they weren't pleasant. And we've been very, very lucky over the last 30 years to have pretty decent economic outlook on life. When it comes to your average salary, apart from in the last decade or so, your average salary going up every year, your savings being worth something, and the lights staying on. Because ask your parents, ask your grandparents what it was like in the 70s with an oil crisis, every 2 oil crises, high unemployment, strikes, power cuts, into the early 80s. There was huge areas of deprivation. Whole regions that basically unemployment rates hit 60% in some towns and cities and villages where most people were unemployed. Labour disputes, crikey, strikes on a daily basis in private and state industries where there's down tools. And then we vote for strike action. Crippling shortage. I mean, southern Italy, and this is something that I think you should be aware of. Southern Italy still had fuel rationing on a World War II level. So you had your coupons until the late 70s. There was still rationing petrol or gasoline, depending if you're in the US, right? Fuel rationing until the late 70s, early 80s. If you went on holiday to Italy, or if your parents did, or grandparents, and you rented a car, or you drove there from wherever you were in Europe, you rented a car, you had to purchase fuel coupons. at the border or at the airport. You had to purchase your fuel coupons, and you would give these coupons over to the petrol station attendant or gas station attendant. You had to give the coupons over. It was a thing. That is generally something that I'm not joking about. Southern Italy had fuel rationing. Bearing in mind, the previous 20 years, you had the Italian economic miracle in the north. Southern Italy was a third world country until like 1970 something. Unemployment was rocketing high and wages didn't exist. People were subsisting. This is why the mafia controls large portions of southern Italy. The mafia organisations, because a legacy of underinvestment by state and national government and poor economic policy. Yeah, it's a thing. And even now, southern Italy would be a failed state. Large parts of rural Greece would be bankrupt. They would be fucked. Well, they are, but they're bailed out by the EU. But if they weren't a member of the EU, they would be buggered. There are parts of Spain where there's no jobs. What you see on the tourist postcards is the Costa del Sol, the Costa Blanca, Mallorca, Ibiza. Spain right now is in a mess because of COVID. Tourism keeps Spain going in huge parts of the country, massive parts of the country. Other parts of the country are dirt poor, massively poor. But you don't see that on the tourist brochures. Malta was in a really bad position until we joined the EU. Horrible position. There's some parts of what is now the EU that is not doing very well. It hasn't done very well for a long time, and there's a reason why they joined the EU is they can get that money. Ireland for a very long time was a very poor country outside of Dublin and Cork, the big towns. Rural Ireland was dirt poor. Northern Ireland is quite poor in comparison to mainland UK, and still is at a lower level of GDP per capita, so per population, 100,000 than all of Greater London. The Northern Ireland economy is smaller than Greater London's economy. I'm just putting it out there. Scandinavia, a lot of Scandinavia, until they joined the EU, or in Norway's case, the EEA, very, very poor. Outside like Stockholm or Oslo or Copenhagen or Helsinki, Reykjavik, until the 80s, Iceland was really dirt poor, relied on cod. Iceland's economy is a lot different now, but really not very wealthy. So be thankful we've had a pretty good time for the last 30 or so years. Because pre-1980, the world was a shit place. Our generation, my generation, are actually, yes, we're not doing as well as our parents, but we're doing better than our grandparents did. And we have to be thankful for that. We don't have rationing. We don't have power cuts 2, 3, 4 times a week. We don't have rampant inflation at 30, 40% inflation. We don't have strikes every day. We don't have food shortages. Something that actually happened in the 70s. Winter of discontent. Ask your parents or grandparents if they're British about the winter of discontent. You could ask if you have any Italian relatives, the years of lead in Italy between the 60s and the 80s, where there was assassinations and bombings every day and political instability. And in 93, they came up with the Second Italian Republic because the first one sort of failed. Ask if you've got any friends who've been to Greece or know Greek history. Ask them about the military governments in the 60s and the 70s that were pretty repressive and brutal. It's a thing. It's a thing. So mainland Europe's had some pretty shitty governments, even though we've had generally peace with mainland Europe until the Yugoslav wars of the 90s. It wasn't pleasant in the 70s. It was pretty shit. I mean, the French were a shocking history when it comes to political violence. But no, seriously, ask some of your older relatives, if you're European, about the 70s and how not very nice they were. We have got it a lot better than the 70s. Trust me, we do. It's the 70s and the early 80s were not very nice for mainland Europe, West or East. In the East, economic sanctions against the Soviet bloc began to bite, and that led to the fall of communism. In the Western Europe, recessions, high unemployment, rediversing the economy, state industries were on their knees, There was strikes a lot in the 70s and in the 80s. A lot of strikes. A lot of strikes. Like, I'm a bin man, right? Waste disposal operative. You know, trash guy, the trash man in America, the bin man in England. You know, is North Korea the worst country in the world in terms of government? Well, that's an interesting question. I wasn't expecting a Kim Jong Un question. For repression against its people, yes. They're still on a Stalinist line of 1953. The world has changed since 1953. Stalin dies and the Korean War ends. Notice that. The Korean War starts. Stalin is still alive when the Korean War starts. Korean War ends when he dies. That's one of the reasons why North Korea decided and South Korea to come to a ceasefire on the 38th parallel. While Stalin was still alive, the Soviet Union was happily funding North Korea. There was a change in policy under Khrushchev. De-Stalinization. North Korea, however, still adopts Stalinist Marxist policies that Khrushchev and subsequent Soviet and Chinese leaders, because the Chinese Communist Party on Chairman Mao, also when they won the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese Red Army went in and fought in North Korea. The Soviets supplied weapons and tanks. So the Stalin government is 70 years out of date. We know that Stalinist policies don't work. If you want to talk about economic, the country's dirt poor. Dirt poor. A higher proportion of its GDP goes to military spending than any other country in the world. It's very repressive. But we don't know enough about what happens inside North Korea to get a fair assessment on that question. If we're talking about Western countries, which I think I'm better disposed to talk about, by Western standards, yeah, pretty repressive. By historical standards, you have to go back to, I think, 1953, I think, to find a country with a similar economic policy. Because every other communist country post the death of Stalin, was a little bit less repressive than Stalin and pre-1953. You could argue about North Vietnam and the Vietnam War, and China, and Laos and Cambodia. I mean, the Khmer Rouge were pretty brutal. The Pol Pot, they were pretty nasty. Some of the crazy African dictators and Central American dictators we've had, like Noriega in Panama, for example, in living memory that I can think of, were pretty shitty. But North Korea is one of those secretive countries that we don't really know a lot about internally, because they're so repressive that you don't get to know what it's like inside. At least the Chinese are pretty open with their human rights abuses. North Korea just hides it pretty well, and they have to smuggle footage out, or smuggle people get smuggled out, like escape across the border to China, Russia, or South Korea. They somehow manage to get across the border via various. I would label North Korea similar to East Germany towards the end with the Stasi, with the people being in fear of the government. I don't know how long North Korea stays along this path of repressiveness, and what happens when Kim Jong Un pops his clogs. I think his sister takes over, and she's apparently even more brutal than he is in her policies. It'll be interesting to see how the Americans deal with the Korean situation with Biden in charge. That will be, I think, the biggest test of foreign policy for Joe Biden. I think Biden will be more conducive to talk to the Cubans, who have actually got free market economics but a one-party state, and the Castros are no longer in charge in Cuba. Every other Western country can go to Cuba as a tourist, apart from Americans. So me as a Brit, I could get a visa to go to Cuba if I really wanted to. And Cuba's a beautiful country, by the way. But the US trade embargo on Cuba, Obama started to have good relations with Raul Castro, the successor of Fidel. Raul Castro is no longer in charge of Cuba. The Castro family is now no longer in the head of government in Cuba. That's one difference between Cuba and North Korea. Cubans are more willing to talk to the Americans if the Americans are conducive to talk back. And the Americans know that Latin America, they have a very big chance to make positive strides in the modern era, because the Cold War is over. And it can be a benefit to have Cuba as a conduit, especially with Biden and Putin. I think what we have with Cuba now is a government more willing to talk to the US than they were 20 years ago. And I think a positive with Biden being president is he's probably more likely to be willing to enter into positive talks with Cuba over a whole host of issues, from drug smuggling to trade to normalizing relations again. I think he would take that next step that Obama wanted to take had, you know, um, Clinton become president. I think they would have continued along that path of positive dialogue between the two nations, because they are neighbours and there is an interest in the Latin American world. If there's a positive relationship there, that can resolve a lot of issues in Latin America, and other Latin American leaders are probably a bit more amenable to talk to the US. Because the US isn't overly popular in Central America. I'm just going to put it out there. The US aren't very popular in South America either, in certain points. But I do think, yeah, North Korea is possibly the most brutal government. I wouldn't say they're the worst government in the world. Because their whole population is 100% Korean. There's no ethnic cleansing going on, or like the Chinese are doing with the Uyghur people. And it's blatantly obvious that there is genocide happening in China. Same with the Turks and the Kurds. I think North Korea, while it's a repressive government against its people, it's a different type of repression. Whereas in other countries there is more issues. I think you could argue Syria is probably a pretty crap government. Iran, take out the economic sanctions, I think Iran would possibly be more amenable. Again, Obama and the Iranians were having conversations towards the end of Obama's time in charge. So foreign policy is going to be crucial for the Americans, but they're not overly liked around various parts of the world. American foreign policy is a little bit. Even American foreign policy with their allies is a bit of a lottery, really, and I don't think Trump's time in the White House has helped that massively. You could argue that Trump's 4 years has damaged foreign policy badly with the US. Although he was seeming to make progress with North Korea. And it's going to be interesting to see how Biden deals with North Korea, Cuba, and Iran. Three biggest problems with US foreign policy is Cuba, Iran, and North Korea, in that order descending. Cuba is an easy one. Iran is obviously since 1979, but North Korea is the US was actually actively at war with North Korea, and technically because there's been no peace treaty between North Korea and the rest of the world, and that's interesting. Also, the relationship with China is going to be really interesting as well. I think the US and China need to have a bit more positive relations, which they haven't had for 4 years because Trump. But foreign policy, I think, was the weakness of the Trump government that I think damaged standing internationally. Domestically, there's a whole host of policies that have gone down very badly. But I'm not an expert on domestic policy of the US. I will say that now. Big statement now. Not a massive expert on the domestic policy of the US. Foreign policy of the US, I know a fair bit about, and the mess that they've made since 1945. Massive, absolute dog's bollocks. Dog's breakfast, sorry. Absolute bollocks they've made of foreign policy. But foreign policy has not necessarily been America's strength since its foundation as an independent country. US foreign policy has always been a bit of a tricky one. Obviously, the War of 1812 is the last time they were actively involved in a war with a European power until 1917. But foreign policy with the US has always been a bit of a mess, because before they joined World War I, they stuck to a policy of domestic only. They didn't really bother too much with Europe. It was obviously more interested in the Pacific as they expanded their nation westwards. And obviously they came into contact with the Japanese and the Chinese, and obviously they had the issues with Japan between the 20s and 1945. But US foreign policy has always been very, very difficult to judge. The Cold War, I think, is what most people see with US foreign policy. So 1945 to 1991. And that's on a basis of mistrust between the Western allies and Soviet Union. And Churchill was right. And whatever you think of Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill was a very flawed figure. He was right about a lot of things. The relationship between the Soviet Union and the rest of the world would, you know, dominate foreign policy until the Soviet Union collapsed, basically, which it did. So from 1945 through to 91, foreign policy was basically a Cold War between East and West, in the sense of they opened up more to China as the decades went on, and Vietnam obviously stopped being a flashpoint in the mid 70s, and normalization of relations between Vietnam and the US happened in time. Cuba and the Soviet Union were the two sticking blocks. And the Soviet Union obviously sponsored North Korea, and there was never any official peace treaties. Technically, the US and South Korea and the rest of the US, technically, the nations that are involved in the Korean War, are technically at war with North Korea. Just going to put that out there. It's the longest ceasefire in history, and technically, we're still technically at war with North Korea. No official peace treaty has actually been signed. So that's an interesting one. That's something I think people need to be aware of, is North Korea is technically still at war with the rest of the world. Yeah. So when you want to talk about your North Korean government policy, they're still technically at war with everyone else, which has led to a lot of diplomatic problems. Same with China and Taiwan. They're still technically at war because Taiwan, or Formosa, as it used to be known, is the old nationalist government of China. Obviously, the Communist Party in mainland China, and they're still technically at war as well. So they're the two longest ceasefires, and occasionally Taiwan and China and North Korea and South Korea lob missiles and artillery shells at each other. There's occasional flare-ups. The bigger concern, I think, would be China and Vietnam going tits up, because the Australians were involved in the Vietnam War from the 60s, 60, it was 65 to 73. The Australians were also actively involved in the Vietnam War between North and South. So the Australians don't particularly want China and Vietnam to have another Gulf of Tonkin incident, because there's a couple of islands in the South China Sea that Vietnam and China are debating about, and have been since the 80s. Because there was a few clashes there, and now China and India are getting a little bit shooty at each other as well over the last 6 months. So China is another issue, I think, for foreign policy for Biden. But yeah, Asian geopolitics. Azerbaijan and Armenia could be a bit shooty as well, and they're technically at war right now. They're another ceasefire. So there's a few flashpoints around the world that are going on actively that have an impact on the big major players, such as the US, the Chinese, the Russians, us. So European NATO powers, the Australians. There's a lot of geopolitics. And then you've got the war in Yemen, which involves Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Iran, they're a bit shooty. And the Saudis, well, they've been basically flattening Yemen for the last 5 years. Bearing in mind what's happening in Syria has allowed the Saudis to basically carpet bomb Yemen, and the Iranians are funding the Yemenis opposition parties and the rebels against the Yemenis government, which is why the Saudis are carpet bombing the place. But I noticed Iran and Saudi Arabia are not actually shooting at each other, because the Iranians want to sell their oil, and if they shut the Gulf of Hormuz, no one can sell their oil. And then there's issues because the US will actually put boots on the ground in Saudi, and then we might have a Saudi-Iran actual conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, which will then just turn the whole Middle East into a shit show, which it sort of is, but it'd be more of a shooting shit show than it was over the last 30 years. And we don't want a fourth intifada in Palestine and Israel. I really don't think we want that. And Israel's a big player in this as well, because Benjamin Netanyahu is the biggest crook Israel's ever had as fucking prime minister, and he needs to be put in prison, along with his wife, who used to be his mistress. That's interesting. His wife is a piece of work. And yeah, we don't want Israel and the Arab world to blow up, because the Arab world's already blowing up, and we don't particularly want Iran and Saudi to actually shoot at each other, because that would be a bit of a shit show. Because we've always had issues with Qatar and the rest of the Arab world. And what's in Qatar? A massive US military base with Air Force, Navy, and Army. And so, yeah, we don't want that to happen. Yes, because that could be a massive problem. Because that would be Sunni on Sunni, and that doesn't normally happen. So we don't particularly want all the Arab states blowing each other up, because That would be a bloody mess. Let the terrorists do that, not the actual governments who are funding the terrorists, because when the actual governments start shooting each other, that makes everyone else's lives a little bit of a pain in the ass. A massive pain in the ass. The UAE are trying to be peace brokers. Jordan are trying to be peace brokers. I don't know how long that can continue, because the Jordanians are hosting a lot of Syrian refugees, and they don't really want any further issues because, quite frankly, they're probably the most stable government in the Middle East is the Jordanians, and we don't really want them getting a bit angst, because 1/3 of their population is Syrian refugees right now, and they don't really want that to flare up out of control, because that would be a mess. We haven't even got to Africa. And you can blame the US and the European powers and China and formerly the Soviet Union for funding militias in Africa for 50 odd years and civil wars and ethnic cleansing and mess. Because our governments are shit. They really are. I really couldn't stress enough that foreign policy with Africa and the aid policy with Africa has been a bit of a shit show since the 1950s. And it all starts with the French in Algeria, and it just goes from there. And the Belgians in Zaire. You just start with. You can look at European foreign policy and decolonization of Africa from the 50s until now, and it has been nothing short of a disaster. Jesus. Could we have fucked it up anymore? I'm not joking. Could we have actually fucked up Africa anymore? It actually starts with the Algerian War of Independence with the French government, which was an absolute mess. And France is still suffering the after effects of that conflict 50, 60 years later. The French are still feeling the after effects of that with issues in their Arab minority communities in Marseille and Paris. They're still feeling the effects of that with what's going on. And then every other conflict in Africa, you can basically trace it back to decolonization in the 1950s and 60s. And 70s with the Portuguese in Angola and Guinea-Bissau. Oh God, the Portuguese involved in Angola was an absolute shit show. People think, the British are the worst imperial power. We really weren't. I can assure you that we were nowhere near as bad as the Belgians and the French and the Portuguese. Jesus. You think we're bad with our colonial history in Africa? You've got to look at some of the worst abuses of colonial power. You have to look at the French and the Belgians and the Portuguese. They did some unspeakable things. And in the aftermath of those states that got independence, oh my God, what an absolute shambles. Absolute shambles. That was just a mess. Absolute mess. And we're still feeling the after effects of it today. I think the only independence in Africa that has had pretty much no violence is Namibia. Yeah, Namibia, probably the most pointless country in Africa in the sense that it has a tiny population. Most stable, Namibia. That's because South Africa had it as a dominion power and then as a republic until 1991 to 94. There was a brief war of independence that was more low-level guerrillas, anti-apartheid, and you haven't really had the same issues with governance and flare-up of anti-apartheid violence with black or white killing, but you've had in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Botswana and Namibia, I think, are the two success stories, and Zambia to a certain extent. The few success stories in Africa when it comes to decolonialization and stability. Zambia, Botswana, and Namibia. Lack of political violence. When it comes to looking at free and fair elections, there's very few allegations of corruption in the sense of vote rigging and political violence. You don't really hear about it. And pretty stable. Poor countries, yes, but pretty stable. And have pretty good relations with the Western world and the East. If you want to go to Africa, go to Botswana, go to Zambia, go to Namibia. You probably you won't get robbed at knife point in the major cities, and B, you're probably welcomed as someone spending their hard-earned cash in a very poor country. You go, please enjoy our food, please enjoy our countryside, please enjoy our historical sites. They're probably the most welcoming countries, I think, in Africa. Because I've got friends from Africa. I've got friends from Zimbabwe who's mixed race. and his family had to flee because I think his dad was white, his mum was black. And Robert Mugabe is not a nice bloke. He's now dead, but Mugabe wasn't a nice bloke, and their property was seized, and they were threatened, and death threats, and they upped and left, and they went to South Africa for a bit, and then my mate Rob ended up over here 20 odd years ago as a teenager. So yeah, there's that. I think Zimbabwe's got a pretty bad track record as a country with a pretty shit government towards its own people. Mozambique, Somalia doesn't really have a government. Zaire, or Democratic Republic of Congo, they had some pretty brutal dictators. Idi Amin in Uganda, oh God, there's been some pretty nasty African dictators. And then you look at Latin America. I mean, you could look at Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Pinochet in Chile for 20 odd years that we funded, which is something that I would rather we didn't. But we have to acknowledge that Pinochet was pretty friendly with the US and the West until he was overthrown. Pretty friendly. This is why America's not very well liked in South America. Noriega, Panama, Nicaragua with the Contras affair under Reagan. You've got El Salvador, Honduras. It's pretty dangerous, pretty shooty. Yes, there's some pretty bad governments in America, in the Americas, that are pretty nasty, left and right wing, that had funding from the Soviet Union and the US. There's some pretty brutal things between the 60s, 50s, 60s, and then the 90s. You could argue they're pretty nasty. And then in the 90s, the military government sort of faded away and democracy coming back across South America for the most part, apart from, I would say, Venezuela. So South America is a lot more politically stable now than what it was during the Cold War. That was a nasty time. If you're Latin American, there's a reason why there's a massive Latin American community in the US. Massive reason. Big reason why a lot of Latin Americans went to the US and into Canada is because of the brutal military regimes, the brutal left-wing regimes, the brutal right-wing regimes. Doesn't matter what. The military regimes were nasty. The Dirty War, as it's known, which is mostly an Argentinian term, but you cover the whole of South and Central America with the Dirty War, where the CIA and the Russian KGB were pumping funds into South and Central America and propping up pretty brutal regimes that brutalized their people. Mostly right wing, which is the CIA, but also some left wing regimes that weren't pretty nice either, pretty nasty. So if you want to rank North Korea, East North Korea isn't funded by another regime. The Russians and Chinese are reasonably friendly because they share a border, but otherwise the Chinese are now the only state aid partner that they get, and it's mostly importing coal so they can keep the lights on. And engineering equipment, mining equipment. The Chinese don't really pump in lots of military technology. The North Koreans are actually developing their own versions under license of Chinese tanks and guns and missiles, and they get second-hand jets. But now, if you want to discuss some pretty brutal times, the Cold War is actually a bit more bloody than economic stuff. There's pretty brutal stuff that happens on both sides, and we don't take any glory out of that. We had the Malay crisis, we had Yemen, the Aden crisis, the Suez Canal crisis. That we actually got the Falklands War is a big point, because the US were funding the Argentinian military junta in the Dirty War. Hence why the US didn't actively get involved in the conflict, because a lot of the weapons were actually French made, ironically. That is crucial. French made jets and missiles, US manufactured rifles and artillery, with some Argentinian industry in there as well. The Reagan administration had just taken power. They were very keen that they had a right-wing anti-communist government in Buenos Aires, and they didn't really get involved. And Thatcher was very unhappy. Like Thatcher, he's a very divisive prime minister, but we didn't get help from our biggest ally. We had to fight it on our own. The French were making a lot of money, and the French were secretly quite happy that we had to deal with it on our own, because the French and the British have a very strained relationship politically when it comes to international relations to a certain extent. So the French government didn't get involved. actively on our side, even though they were actively funding the Argentinians with military sales in the 70s and 80s, and it was a pretty brutal time. The US could have stopped the Falklands War from happening. They didn't. They were a bit pissed off that the military junta actually lost power, ironically. And they were pissed off when Pinochet lost power as well. They were only there because they were anti-communist. The USA actually were funding military dictatorships in Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Panama, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, to a certain extent Mexico. There was military dictatorships across Latin America, which has ultimately led to the refugee crisis that we have today. The brutal repressive regimes that were actively funded by the CIA and the various administrations from Nixon through to Reagan. Oh yeah. And the Soviet Union were funding Venezuela and Cuba and Grenada to a point as well. Oh yeah, Grenada, yes, a lovely Caribbean island destination, was actively funded by the Soviet Union in the 80s, 70s and 80s, which led to a US invasion of Grenada in, I think, 1983, I think. The only two wars America actually won with boots on the ground was the invasion of Panama and the invasion of Grenada, two banana republics in the Caribbean, Central America. That was it. Every other conflict America's been involved in since 1945, they are either not won or have lost and don't like anything that they've lost. Yeah, America could only beat Grenada and Panama. Just going to put that out there. One of the countries that they won a war against, they were actively funding until they went, you know what, we don't like Noriega anymore, we're going to overthrow him. There you go. That's a nutshell on American foreign military policy. Since 1945, it's been a shit show. Because America was geared to fight the Soviet Union. It wasn't geared to fight guerrilla tactics and guerrilla wars, and it wasn't geared to fight in the jungles of South and Central America or Vietnam against irregular forces, as they also found out in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 30 years. The US is geared to fight a conventional enemy. So, yes, they defeated Iraq in Gulf War I. But if you look at American foreign military engagements since 1945, it hasn't gone very well, really. Yeah. American military involvement overseas has been a bit of a mess. And a lot of American lives have been lost because when they get involved, they defeat the military on the ground initially. And then you have insurgents for the next forever. So American foreign policy and military involvement hasn't been great since 1945 because they are geared to fighting a conventional enemy with similar armaments and similar training. And the Bay of Pigs is the first fiasco, I think, of American foreign policy in the Cold War. The intervention in North Korea, I think, saved South Korea from becoming communist. Was it a war that they should have been fought? Probably not. It's left a legacy of a mess in the Korean Peninsula, partly because they decided to disarm the entire Japanese army after 1945. Rather than keeping the Japanese army there as a sort of police force, they disarmed it and made a mess out of the rebuilding of Korea post 1945 because it was partitioned, and they installed a military dictator in the south, and the Soviets installed a military dictator in the north. So that went horribly wrong when you have military dictators in charge of a country that hasn't been independent since the Korea has been a battleground for the Russian Empire, the Japanese Empire, the Chinese Empire for 400 years. Yeah, that's what happens. It's only since 1945 that Korea's really actually had independence, and now it's split in two between ultra capitalists in the south and ultra socialists, Marxists in the north. And until 1988, South Korea was a military dictatorship. It's only in the last 33 years that South Korea has become a democracy. And even so, it's a militarized democracy because you have to do compulsory military service for 2 years. So every Korean male and I think a lot of Korean females have to do conscription. One of the few Western countries to still have that policy in place. So South Korea is basically an armed capitalist state and has been for 33 years. It's the wealthiest arms arsenal in the world. I think there's 75,000 US personnel stationed in South Korea. And that alarms Japan that South Korea is the biggest overseas military base in the world. And there could be a war on their very doorstep at any time. And hence why the Japanese have started to reverse their policy of limited rearmament. Because the Japanese are restricted by treaties, so they're limiting their army to 100,000 men. The Japanese are starting to slowly rearm, quite publicly as well, because the Japanese don't want Korea Mark II to happen, and the Japanese aren't overly keen on the Chinese overtaking them as the second biggest economy in the world. That's the thing. So if we're discussing North Korea, it could be a flashpoint, but I think China's the bigger problem. China could be the bigger issue long term for Biden as US president. But earlier there was a question saying I should be a history lecturer at university. Christ, I would put a lot of these left-wing loony liberals in their place, and I'll put a lot of right-wing liberal loons in their place as well. I don't like the politics that we have, our divisive politics that we have today, because, well, look at it. We've been down this road before. It's called the 1920s. After World War One, there wasn't really, for the first few years, there wasn't really an appetite to kill each other anymore. And that changed with economic chaos and a pandemic, ironically. We had the Spanish flu pandemic, which killed a lot of people, more than this COVID-19 crap. And then there was economic downturns throughout the 20s and the 30s that led to the rise of dictatorships because democracy failed. And democracy is failing right now. We've learned nothing over the last 85, 90 years, clearly, because we had to slaughter 60 million people in the 40s to really get a point of, this democracy lark, and it's kind of a good thing. We don't know a good thing when we see it. Could I react to your beat? Your beat. Assuming you are a musician, I'm open to listening to some music. Yeah, I'm put a link in the chat section. I can come back to it, or when this live stream is finished, put a link in the comment section. I'm more than happy to have a listen to your music. I will listen to anything at least once. I like my blues. I do like jazz. I do like some blues. I like some Delta rock. I like Delta blues, which is Mississippi, deep South music, which is where ZZ Top gets their southern twang from with their music, which is where obviously rhythm and R&B comes from, and a blues jazz comes from the Mississippi River Valley. There you go. Didn't know that, did you? And ironically, rock and roll comes from African Americans. Yeah, well, people don't know that either. I like Motown, but I like my heavy metal most. Not gonna lie. If you ask me what my favourite bands are, you'll be quite surprised considering the clothes that I'm wearing. But I do like my heavy metal, and there's all the different subgenres of that. But I will happily listen to Motown. I'll happily listen to smooth jazz. I would happily listen to early R&B. Oh yeah, and I would happily listen to classical music. It's really weird. But no, there's a lot of interesting stuff that I could listen to. Just whack a link in the description. I'm more than happy to do so. But no, back to currently goings on. It's an interesting time. and we will see what happens with the Dutch, because I think that's the next big flare-up, is what's happening in Holland with a reaction to the stricter lockdown measures the Dutch government, or the Dutch caretaker government put in place. The ongoing nightly riots, they will burn themselves out. I can't see these people doing it every night, but there's a definite breakdown between a huge proportion of Dutch society and what's going on with the political direction of Holland, with restrictions being strengthened rather than eased, whereas other countries are looking at, we've got a vaccine rollout, we're going to look at reopening the economy, the Dutch going the other way. So, whereas other countries are setting out a roadmap of 2021, the vaccination program, opening up the economy, getting normality back, reducing restrictions, the Dutch are going the other way. And with the EU having a vaccine rollout problem, and with a shortage, it's going to be interesting, very interesting times. But I'm going to leave that there. Hopefully, live streams will become more of a thing on this channel over the coming weeks and months. There's a lot going on politically, and I will be following what happens with Biden in the US. I'll be following what happens in Holland quite closely, because it's only across the channel. And obviously, the Italian government could collapse at any time. So another major NATO and EU partner that the UK has is right up the shitter. And there's a lot going on. And this is the non-sports channel, so I've neglected the history botting for a good 6 months, and it's kind of nice to do a video on the channel and talk about non-sport stuff, because talking about sport every day, or regularly, well, I love it. You do get a bit tired talking the same stuff day after day after day after day. So it's kind of nice to have a little change. So there'll be more content on this channel coming. Thank you very much for watching. I know I've rambled a bit, but it'll be, I think next time I'm going to do a live stream, I'll do an announcement on the main channel, get you guys to come across, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much for watching, and keep your eyes peeled. There'll be more content on the channel very, very soon.